Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining. Today, we're going to talk about ShadowPad, one of the most successful paid backdoor in Chinese espionage. ShadowPad was used as the primary backdoors of several infamous attacks, including CCleaner, NetSarang, and ShadowHammer supply chain attacks. In this talk, we would like to address the following questions. Why did it become the primary choice in those high-impact attacks? What makes it so special in the pages of Chinese espionage? What threat actors are using ShadowPad in their operations? And ultimately, how does the emergence of ShadowPad impact the wider threat landscape from Chinese espionage actors? I'm Yi-Jhen, and now I'm a threat intelligence researcher at SentinelOne. I personally focus on malware analysis and Chinese espionage campaign tracking. Prior to SentinelOne, I was a Tier 3 analyst to offer in-depth analysis to incident response cases. Together with me is Chen. He's a threat intelligence researcher at SentinelOne. His major area of research includes incident response, APD investigation, malware analysis, and cryptography analysis. Today, we will start with some background history of ShadowPad. Then, we will dig into its technical details and the business model behind this backdoor. After that, we will introduce some of the threat actors who are using ShadowPad. At the end, we will discuss how ShadowPad changes the attacker's operations and the landscape. Before we jump into the details of ShadowPad, let's start from some historical background of it. So, what is ShadowPad? It's a modular backdoor, which means it is formed of a bunch of plugins and it is in shellcode format. Every plugin contains a specific functionality, and you can plug or unplug a plugin in memory from the CNC server. This offers good extensibility to ShadowPad's functionality. ShadowPad has been used by some high-profile threat actors, and it was used in those campaigns as one of the primary backdoors for intrusion. For example, it appeared in some well-known supply chain attacks conducted by APT41, including NetSarang, ShadowHammer, and alleged CCleaner. Another high-profile group, Tick and Tonto team, also used it to attack Japan Aerospace Exploration Agency and other victims. We will cover more details later. When we trace back to the emergence of ShadowPad, we need to spend some time discussing another backdoor called PlugX. PlugX is also a plugin-based backdoor in shellcode format. The major difference between PlugX and ShadowPad is that the plugins of PlugX cannot be plugged or unplugged during runtime. Regarding the use of these two backdoors, ShadowPad is only shared beyond a limited set of users based on our knowledge, while PlugX is widely used and sold to different people in public. What's the relationship between these two backdoors? There are already some reports that discuss their code similarity, and we will not cover more on this part here. We discovered another piece of evidence. Actually, PlugX and ShadowPad share the same project name Hsieh. We extracted the PDB strings of the controllers, and you can see S controller and Hsieh in them. This suggests that ShadowPad is highly likely the successor project of PlugX with a related project base. If we dig deeper to the author of PlugX, we can trace back to a name WHG, aka Wu Huaguo. He was based in Sichuan, China, and he was an experienced programmer with deep knowledge of backdoors and hacking tools. According to a report from AT&T, his nickname showed up in some PlugX samples. Besides, he claimed that he was selling some shared software on his personal website back in 2006. It means that he was used to monetizing his malware development skills and the programs he produced. Also, he was sharing some deep connections with one of the biggest users of ShadowPad, APT41, and we would address this later. After the background introduction, we can move to something more technical. As I mentioned earlier, ShadowPad is a modular design. It is formed of a bunch of plugins with different functionalities inside. This picture shows the brief concept. First, there is a layer of obfuscated shellcode loader. It decrypts and loads a plugin called root. You can easily tell what root is by its name. This is a very basic plugin to decrypt and load other plugins which are embedded inside the samples, and it contains the block of encrypted configurations. The plugins will be loaded into memory, and they will be kept in a linked list for further reference. On the right is the structure of a plugin node in the linked list. There is some metadata like the timestamp of a plugin, the plugin ID, the size, the base memory address of the plugin, and the export function table. Aside from the plugins embedded in the sample, additional plugins could be uploaded to the infected host from the CNC servers. For example, if the disk plugin is not embedded inside the sample at the first place, after ShadowPad connects back to the CNC server, the attacker can upload the disk plugin through the controller. The plugin will be sent to the infected computer, and the backdoor will decrypt it, load it into the memory, and store it in the linked list as well. This gives the user a big flexibility to add plugins whenever they need. From the sample sets we collected, we got 22 unique plugins. I briefly divide the plugins to two sets. The first set is basic set. This set of plugins covers the routine from the installation of the ShadowPad, like decrypting configuration, installing it for persistency, and firing back the first beacon connection back to the CNC server. In other words, with this set of plugins, the backdoor can build the connection with the CNC servers, but at this moment, it will not contain any other backdoor functionalities. The second set is utilities. This set contains the plugins with all kinds of backdoor functionalities, such as browsing disks, managing services and registries, executing shell commands, key logging, screen control, and so on. Only with these plugins, ShadowPad can present the functionalities of a backdoor. So to use ShadowPad, the users need to have utility plugins. Regarding the configuration, this table shows all of the columns in the configuration. The first two columns, offset product key and offset nodes, are the identifiers of the campaign. They could be randomly generated. And later comes the binary path, the service settings, and run key registries. The default name of the service is myTest. This could be the useful indicator to check ShadowPad infections in some cases. And there comes the spawn process to do code injections, CNC servers, proxy types, and DNS. In 2020, another new version of ShadowPad was found by Positive Technologies. The infection chain of the new version includes three components. The first one is a legitimate executable, log.exe, and it will sideload an obfuscated loader called log.dll. This loader will then read and decrypt another piece of payload, log.dat. Log.dat is the main shellcode of ShadowPad, which is also obfuscated with the same technique. Besides, the sample is obfuscated with control flow flattening technique. This is the new obfuscation technique on ShadowPad, which we didn't see before. The configuration of this new version looks pretty similar to the previous version, except that it includes more details of the infection chain. So as here shows, there are columns for the installation directory, the legitimate executable name, the loader name, and the payload name. Next, we are going to introduce one version of the ShadowPad controllers. We discovered it in an attacker's hacking package through private research. This controller helps us a lot in this research because it allows us to get a much closer look at how ShadowPad works and how it was originally designed. This is version 1.0 in 2015. It was written in Delphi, and the controller contains both the binary builder and the CNC listener in one. The ShadowPad samples built by this controller are a little bit simpler than the later version, but the samples are already constructed in a very much similar way to the samples after 2017. By right-clicking on any single infection host, we will enter the management console of the backdoor. So first, you will see the default plugin list. These plugins are the plugins which are embedded inside the backdoor samples by default. If you want to use other plugins, you need to right-click the console, choose Add, and import the plugins. Then the plugins will be uploaded. After that, you will see the uploaded plugins in red, and you can start using those plugins with the menu on the left. To be noted, you can only upload the plugins, but the list of the control interface is fixed. So even if you have an additional plugin, like a plugin pipe here, you still cannot use it, because there is no control interface of pipe in the list. Then here comes the builder. The builder allows us to configure different columns like campaign codes and nodes. They can also be randomly generated. And then there are some anti-debugging debugging settings and the installation settings. Also, we can modify the process to be spawned and injected during runtime. Of course, we can add the CNC servers with different protocols to connect. After we finish the settings, we can export the current settings and import them next time. And then we can build it. There's an option to build it as an executable, but the loader is pretty dumb, and we didn't source any samples with this loader. This function might be improved in the later version, but it seems that most of the users only generate shellcode and use their own loaders. The discovery of the controller allows us to check more deeply on how ShadowPad works from the attacker side. In the next section, we're going to introduce the ecosystem and the business model behind ShadowPad from our observation and assessment. Let's start from the structure of the controller. The plugins are placed in a directory. Whenever the user needs to upload a plugin, they can choose the one they need from the directory. So, in theory, any plugin encrypted and compressed in the correct format could be uploaded. If anyone wants to add a new plugin, he or she can develop one and upload it to the client side. But in practice, the user needs an interface on the controller to interact with the plugins. When we check the controller, we will see those interfaces listed on the left, and there is no option to upload a new interface from any new plugin. This means that the controller is not designed to accept new plugins. The list of available plugins is highly controlled by the developer. Based on the controller, we now know that ShadowPad is not designed to be extendable by a random user. The developer controls which plugins could be added and used. So ShadowPad is not an open framework like Metasploit to accept other self-developed plugins. Then why is it designed to be a plugin-based malware and allows remote upload to the plugins? Probably it is because the developer can easily control the plugins to be used by any user. If a developer wants to remove certain functionalities, he or she only needs to remove that plugin from the directory and does not need to recompile the controller and the malware again. Next, let's check the plugins embedded inside the samples. As I described beforehand, there are some plugins embedded in the sample by default, and additional plugins can be uploaded remotely later on. We plot the plugin numbers across around 100 samples. As you can see, most of the samples only contain less than 9 plugins, and the plugins are the basic set, including root, plugins, config, install, online, and the plugins for CNC communication. This plugin can only finish the installation and send a beacon to the CNC servers. No other functionalities could be presented. If the attackers want to use other functions, they need to upload those plugins from the CNC servers. Other two distributions are both special cases. The samples with 10 plugins are a special version packed with VM Protect, and all of the plugins are with different plugin IDs. The samples might have been used by APT41 for some campaigns, including ShadowHammer. The final category is the sample with additional utility plugins embedded inside, which means the attackers by default can use those plugins. They did not need to upload those plugins manually. The samples in this category are all packed by the SAM packers, while the packers seem not to be provided by default with the ShadowPad builders. The users of this set of samples might have been some people with high privilege access to ShadowPad, and the developer of ShadowPad provides them a special version of Builder to build the samples with utility plugins embedded inside. From the above observation, we can see that most of the samples do not have utility plugins embedded inside. The users need to upload other utility plugins remotely through the controller. And as I mentioned earlier, the plugins can be easily removed from the package. You just need to remove them from the directory. Besides, we found Tick used the tool with the same functionality of the plugin called software in an overlapped timeframe. Tick was one of the active users of ShadowPad and started to have access to ShadowPad from at least 2018. While they used ShadowPad as the main backdoor for intrusion, they sometimes still develop some small tools. We discovered a tool from them to list all of the installed software on an infected host, but around the same time, ShadowPad already had a plugin called software, which did exactly the same. By this, we can assess that Tick did not have access to that plugin, and that was why they need to develop another tool for the same purpose. So the plugins should be provided separately. The developer of ShadowPad could decide which plugins they are going to give to the users, and not all of the users have access to all of the plugins. At the same time, they also offer special versions of ShadowPad Builder to high-privileged users, which allow them to build samples with more plugins embedded by default. So here's the brief summary of the potential business model behind ShadowPad. First of all, it is highly likely a sold malware. Its ancestor, PlugX, was a sold malware, while the author also had demonstrative records of selling malware and tools to others. But ShadowPad should only be accessed by a limited set of users. We do not see a wide distribution like the case of PlugX. Besides, the utility plugins need to be bought separately. The developer does not provide all of the available plugins to the users by default, and sometimes he or she offers special versions to some high-privileged users. Also, ShadowPad is only provided to a limited set of users, as we do not see a wide distribution like PlugX during our study.
Thanks, Yi-Jhen, for sharing those technical details about ShadowPad. Next, we are going to discuss who have access to ShadowPad. As we mentioned before, ShadowPad is sold privately to a limited set of customers. We identified at least 5 activity actors that are using ShadowPad since 2017, including APT41, Tick and Tando Team, Operation Red Bonus, Operation Red Cuckoo, and Fishmonger. Some other vendors also mentioned other potential users of ShadowPad, including Lucky Mouse and the Tropic Trooper. But we don't have the visibility on those parts. So, in this section, we will only focus on those 5 actors' activities. The first one is APT41. APT41 is the accept naming convention of the activities conducted by 2 subgroups, barium and lead. Some of the actors were identified by the US Department of Justice in 2020. All of the defendants were based in Chengdu, Sichuan. Barium was one of the most earliest threat groups that got access to ShadowPad. The primary attacked company is the gaming industry, and they also conduct several supply chain attacks, including NetSarang, ShadowHammer, and the CCleaner. In ShadowHammer instance, the sample of ShadowPad were highly customized compared to other ShadowPad samples. Every layer of shadow code and the plugin was packed with VM Protect, and the plugins had a different set of plugin IDs. Another subgroup lead also used ShadowPad and other backdoors to attack victims for both financial and espionage purpose. One of the actors' roles, aka 凋零玫瑰, were used to cooperating with WHG, who is the author of PlugX we mentioned before. They developed some malwares together. Back in the days, roles was a member of the hacking group NCPH. So, what is NCPH? NCPH was a hacking group founded by Rose and his friend in Chengdu. NCPH means network, cracking, program, and hacking. They released some malwares and hacking tools on their website. For example, they released a series of remote access Trojan called NCPH Remote Control Software. The controller and the builder were freely shared on NCPH website. But they also declared the source code on sale. NCPH Remote Control Software was co-developed by Rose and WHG. They put their name on the controller. Rose and WHG both had great malware development skills and were well known in Chinese hacking community. As you can see, they both were used to minimize their software and malware development skills. Considering the long-term affiliation relationship between Rose and WHG, we suspect that Rose likely had high privilege access to ShadowPad, or he might have even been a co-developer. This could also explain why Rose was able to use a special version of ShadowPad in some of the attacks. Here is another group's Tick and Tangdo team. Tick and Tangdo team have been an active user of ShadowPad since 2018. Those two groups merged into a new institution during the reorganization of PLA. They already been identified significant resource sharing between them, such as the overlap of CNC infrastructure and the utility of similar toolset. A notable change after the merge was that they start to use ShadowPad as their primary backdoor for conducting intrusion activity. In the past, they were known to develop their own backdoors for their own operations. Throughout 2019, Tick crafted and sent spear phishing emails to deliver ShadowPad in victims' network for information stealing and long-term espionage. In 2020, Tangdo team exploited CVE 2019-9489 and CVE 2020-8468 in Chen Micro's security solutions that were exposed in the internet in order to deliver ShadowPad into internal network for further explanation. Based on the sample set we collect, Tick and Tangdo team used at least 5 different versions of ShadowPad. However, all of the sample only contain the basic set of plugins. Because they still have the ability to develop tools by themselves, although they turn from self-developed backdoors to the awkward or leaked backdoors, they still develop some customized tools for intrusion, such as modified minicats, a screen capture tool, a package transmission tool, a tool to list all of the software in your computer, and a VBScript command executor tool. In addition, we found a VBScript command executor tool builder, which can generate a payload of VBScript with built-in evasion technical to bypass Chen Micro products. Most important of all, why we think ShadowPad sell plugins? Because we saw this case. Tick decided not to buy a full version of it, and they decided to create a tool by themselves. Here is another cluster. We cut a ShadowPad activity cluster which had not clear link to a known threat groups. We also track this activity and name it as an operation rate bonus. The first activity of ShadowPad we discovered occurred at the end of 2019. All the samples we collect from Operation Rate Bonus were run the same version of ShadowPad. During our investigation, we also spot other backdoors in use, such as Whitebird, IceFrog, and a customized instance of PC share. The actors show interesting on India targets, with several DNS domain spoofing some India institution. And another small set of ShadowPad sample without clear attribution in the public domain. Interesting part is, all of the CNC server extract from the samples had the same self-signed certificates. Some related samples were documented to be a part of the PlugX logon attack, according to the report by Hsieh. Another activity cluster has been active since at least 2018, and we call it Fishmonger. The victim including university, government, media sector, technology company, and healthy organizations that conducted COVID-19 research in Hong Kong, Taiwan, India, and the US. The cluster is tracking based on the overlap of infrastructure and indicators, as well as some behavior connection between different campaigns. Back in 2019, the actor used a special version of ShadowPad, which allowed them to generate samples with a handful of plugins embedded by default. In 2020, they gained access to a new version of ShadowPad, which had updated and more advanced obfuscation technicals. We focused on those self-signed certificate is installed on several CNC servers of ShadowPad and the Spider. So, this group used ShadowPad and Spider as their primary backdoors for long-term monitoring on their target now. This section, we are going to talk about how does ShadowPad influence the threat landscape of Chinese espionage activities. We will use famous Chinese espionage actors as an example, and we have been monitoring this group at least 4 years. It is not a secret that the number of Chinese threat groups develop their own tool set based on their needed during operations. However, in order to establish espionage, threat actors will also need other tooling to add it to their operations. For example, Minicats, Yi-Jhen, PlugX, and Ghost. Or the popularity of malware recently, such as ShadowPad and Cobalt Strike, among Chinese espionage groups. Here, we use Tick as an example. It was one of the most active users of ShadowPad, according to our research. Prior to this, Tick was documented to be using self-developed backdoors, including Deserve, XSMM, and Depter. There is a notable change we discovered during the monitoring of the threat groups, and we draw this change to a timeline table here. According to the timeline, we could see this actor stopped the use of their self-developed backdoors and start to using the backdoors they bought, and name this backdoor as Casper. This backdoor Casper is the ShadowPad. So, what is the benefit of this change and why they decide to use self-developed backdoors to awkward backdoors? There are two answers that could answer those questions. First one is actors want to lower the cost, spend less time on well-designed malware, and reduce the human resource to develop the malwares. Especially when it contains some complicated functionality like VNC, it is hard to ensure such functionality will not crash the program on the client side. if the attackers outsourcing the development of backdoors, they do not need to spend doing development and QA testing. They can put more resource on the other part of operations. Second one is the occurring backdoors usually will keep enhance the stability and the usability. The seller need to have a goodwill for their product. So, they will provide newest version of backdoors with new feature added. Or like ShadowPad with a complete set of plugins. It covers most of the important functional of backdoors, such as disk browsing, shell command execution, remote desktop, and so on. It is flexible to allow attacker decide which plugin to buy. And those kind of private assault malware, unlike community malwares, found in the cybercriminal or underground forums. So here, now we can make up our conclusions. When we're doing this research, we keep asking ourselves those three questions. Why do the actors choose to use ShadowPad? And why ShadowPad is not disappearing? How ShadowPad affects threat intelligence? About why actors choose ShadowPad, we come up with some ideas. ShadowPad was created by an experienced development, and it is also under activity maintenance on both its functionality and its anti-forensic capability. So that is good for actors. Also, using ShadowPad reduces the cost of development, and using ShadowPad could make security company hard to do further research about it. And the second question, why ShadowPad is not disappearing? One of the reasons is that malware still under update right now, with more advanced obfuscation and persistent technicals. The only reason is ShadowPad, because ShadowPad is a powerful backdoor with so many functionality and so good for long-term espionage operations and good at keeping self-stealthy under the radar. The last question, how ShadowPad affect threat intelligence? To be honest, it affects a lot. If threat intelligence researchers want to do attribution research, they need to require careful validation and a strong inventory to support so that it could help the community's effort to identify Chinese espionage groups. So here is our talk. Thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, please feel free to ask.